The yard goes silent seconds before the alarm begins. Inside the recreation yard at Pelican Bay State Prison, hundreds of inmates suddenly stop moving at once. Some step backward. Others turn away quickly. Correctional officers standing in elevated gun towers notice the shift immediately. Because experienced officers learn something important about prison yards. Real danger often appears before anyone throws a punch. The signs are small at first. Groups separating. Conversations stopping. Certain inmates moving into position. And then it happens. A loud whistle blasts across the yard. Officers shout commands over the speakers as emergency alarms begin echoing through the prison. Inmates down. Down now. Some inmates immediately lie flat on the concrete. Others freeze where they stand. Several officers rush toward the center of the yard while armed tower officers monitor everything from above. Within seconds, the entire prison yard changes from routine recreation into emergency lockdown. Because prison yards are some of the most dangerous places inside American correctional facilities. Not because violence happens constantly, but because when tensions rise there, hundreds of inmates may already be present in one open space. And once chaos begins, controlling it becomes extremely difficult. But why are prison yards so important inside prisons? Why do correctional officers monitor them so closely? And why do inmates organize themselves so carefully there? To understand that, we have to go back. Back before the alarm. Back before the emergency lockdown. Back to how prison yards operate every single day inside America's highest security prisons. Years earlier, prison administrators across the United States realized that recreation yards were both necessary and dangerous. Inmates needed outdoor movement, exercise, and social interaction. But gathering large numbers of inmates together also created security risks. Especially inside maximum security prisons where gang tensions and rival groups already existed. At facilities like USP Beaumont and ADX Florence, prison yards were designed with heavy security measures. Guard towers, fencing, surveillance cameras, controlled entry points, armed response teams. Every detail mattered. Because correctional systems understood something very clearly. The prison yard could become unpredictable within seconds. Back at Pelican Bay, an inmate named Daniel enters the recreation yard during afternoon movement. Daniel has spent years inside California's prison system. Long enough to understand yard politics. Long enough to understand invisible boundaries. And long enough to know that where you stand in the yard matters. As inmates walk through the gates under officer supervision, the yard slowly fills with activity. Some inmates walk laps around the track. Others lift weights. Several sit at tables speaking quietly. At first glance, the yard almost looks calm. But Daniel sees the structure underneath everything. Northern California groups stay mostly near one side. Southern California inmates gather elsewhere. White inmate groups remain near another section. Black inmate groups organize in different areas too. These divisions are not officially assigned by prison staff. But inside many high-security prisons, inmates often separate themselves based on race, gang affiliation, neighborhood connections, or alliances. Correctional officers monitor these patterns constantly. Because changes in those patterns can signal growing tension. This is the low moment. The quiet routine before danger appears. Daniel walks slowly near the track while watching the yard carefully. He notices officers in the towers scanning the crowd continuously through binoculars. Others patrol near fences and gate entrances. Every movement into and out of the yard is controlled. Metal detectors. Search procedures. Scheduled movement times. Everything designed to reduce risk. Yet despite all these systems, prison yards remain high-pressure environments. One afternoon, Daniel watches officers suddenly cancel recreation early after noticing tension between two inmate groups near the handball courts. No violence occurs. But experienced officers recognize warning signs quickly. Separate groups standing too close. Sudden silence. Certain inmates signaling to each other. The yard is cleared immediately. Because prison staff understand something important. Preventing violence often depends on spotting danger before it happens. Across the United States, correctional officers train constantly for yard emergencies. Large inmate gatherings require coordinated response plans. If incidents occur, officers isolate sections quickly, separate groups, and regain control before situations spread. At Pelican Bay and other maximum security facilities, armed tower officers provide additional security during yard movement because ground staff alone may not be enough during major incidents. Back inside the housing unit later that evening, Daniel sits quietly near the television area listening to older inmates discuss prison politics. One inmate talks about yard restrictions at San Quentin State Prison years earlier after gang tensions increased. Another mentions lockdowns at Folsom State Prison following yard incidents. The stories all sound similar. Tension builds slowly. Then suddenly, everything changes. Daniel notices younger inmates listening carefully. Because inside prison, understanding the yard is part of survival. You learn where not to stand, who not to interrupt, when to stay quiet, and when to leave an area immediately. The next morning, recreation resumes under tighter supervision. Additional officers stand near the gates. Movement onto the yard happens more slowly than usual. Inmates notice immediately. Because increased security usually means prison intelligence officers believe tensions are rising again. Daniel steps onto the yard carefully. The atmosphere feels different today. More alert. Conversations stay shorter. Several inmates keep scanning the crowd instead of relaxing. Even the officers seem tense. Then Daniel notices something else. A section of the yard near the basketball court has been left unusually empty. That matters. Because empty space inside prison yards is often intentional. Inmates avoid areas where they expect problems could start. Correctional officers notice the empty section too. Two officers quietly reposition themselves nearby while tower staff continue observing from above. Minutes pass slowly. Nothing happens. But the tension keeps building. A group near the pull-up bars suddenly stops talking. Another group near the track changes direction. Daniel feels it immediately. The atmosphere shifting. The same way it shifted at the start of the story. An older inmate walking beside Daniel quietly says, "Something's wrong." Then the yard falls silent. Not fully silent, but close enough that everyone notices. Even officers stop moving for a second. Because experienced inmates and correctional staff recognize this moment. The moment before chaos. One inmate suddenly steps away from a table and begins moving quickly across the yard. Another group reacts immediately. Officers shout commands at once. Emergency whistles blast through the air. And the entire yard erupts into motion again. Inmates drop to the ground. Others rush toward fences. Tower officers raise rifles toward the sky while response teams sprint through the gates. Daniel hits the concrete beside the track exactly as instructed. Hands visible. Eyes down. Because another important prison yard rule is simple. During emergencies, survival often means staying completely still. The officers regain control quickly this time. Faster than before. Groups are separated. Movement stops. Additional response teams secure the gates. Medical staff wait outside the yard perimeter until officers confirm the area is safe. The emergency response works exactly as trained. But even after control returns, the tension remains heavy. Because prison staff now face another challenge. Finding out what caused the incident before it spreads further. As inmates remain on the ground waiting for escort back to housing units, Daniel glances carefully across the concrete. He notices several officers surrounding one inmate near the basketball court. Then he notices something even more worrying. Another section of the yard near the fencing appears completely empty. Too empty. As if several inmates disappeared during the confusion. And suddenly, correctional officers begin shouting new commands into their radios. Because the emergency may not be over after all. The yard remains locked down. At Pelican Bay State Prison, inmates lie face down on the concrete while correctional officers move carefully between groups under the watch of armed tower staff. The emergency whistles have stopped now. But the tension feels even heavier. Because officers have realized something serious. Several inmates are unaccounted for inside the recreation area. Radios crackle constantly across the yard. Check the fencing section. Secure the handball area. Count every inmate again. Daniel keeps his eyes down as instructed. Around him, other inmates stay completely still. Inside prison yards, moments after an emergency are often the most dangerous. Confusion spreads fast, and officers must regain full control quickly before rumors or panic create new problems. Minutes later, response teams discover the missing inmates near a maintenance section beside the outer fencing. The inmates had moved during the confusion when officers rushed toward the basketball court area. The situation is brought under control immediately, but the incident changes the atmosphere across the entire prison. Because now administrators believe the emergency may have been planned to distract officers from movement happening elsewhere in the yard. That possibility matters. Inside high-security prison yards, correctional staff constantly watch for coordinated behavior. Not just violence. Movement. Signals. Distractions. Every detail matters. As officers escort inmates back toward housing units, Daniel notices something important. No one is speaking loudly. No one is arguing. The entire prison feels quieter than normal. Because everyone understands what comes next. Searches. Lockdowns. Investigations. This is the low moment. The tense silence after chaos. Back inside the housing unit, inmates are ordered directly into cells while correctional officers begin emergency searches. Mattresses are removed. Vent covers inspected. Personal property checked carefully. Special search teams move through the building with flashlights and metal detectors. At facilities like USP Lewisburg and California State Prison, Correctional, prison administrators often respond to yard incidents with expanded searches and movement restrictions. Because incidents in recreation yards sometimes connect to larger security concerns inside the prison. Contraband. Gang communication. Retaliation plans. Correctional intelligence units investigate all of it. Daniel sits quietly on his bunk watching officers search nearby cells. The atmosphere inside the housing unit feels tense but controlled. Experienced inmates already understand the routine. After major yard incidents, prisons often enter temporary lockdown status. Movement stops. Programs pause. Even meals may be delivered directly to cells. The goal is simple. Prevent further conflict while investigators gather information. Hours later, correctional officers begin escorting selected inmates individually toward interview rooms. Daniel watches several inmates from different groups leave the housing unit under supervision. That matters too. Because prison staff are trying to understand what triggered the yard incident before it grows into something larger. Inside prison systems, recreation yards are often viewed as pressure points. Large numbers of inmates gather together in one place. Gang rivalries become more visible. Territorial divisions become easier to observe. And small disputes can spread quickly if not controlled early. That is why prison yards are heavily structured environments. At many high-security prisons, inmates enter yards in controlled groups and during scheduled time blocks. Officers monitor body language, movement patterns, and interactions constantly. Tower officers maintain elevated views of the entire yard. Some prisons even separate recreation periods for rival groups to reduce risk. But complete separation is difficult in overcrowded correctional systems. The next morning, Daniel notices the prison remains under modified lockdown procedures. Recreation is cancelled. Meal movement is heavily restricted. Extra officers stand near stairwells and gates. The tension spreads through every housing unit. At breakfast, inmates speak quietly about what happened the day before. Some believe the basketball court incident started from gang tensions. Others think the real goal was distracting officers from the movement near the fence. No one knows the full story. And inside prison, uncertainty increases tension almost as much as violence itself. Later that afternoon, Daniel speaks quietly with an older inmate named Victor during limited dayroom access. Victor spent years moving through different California prisons. He understands yard politics deeply. "You know why yards get dangerous?" Victor asks softly. Daniel shrugs slightly. "Too many people together." Victor nods once. "That's part of it. But mostly it's pressure." Daniel listens carefully. Victor points toward the crowded housing unit around them. People carry problems onto the yard. Gang problems. Street problems. Personal problems. Then everybody watching everybody at the same time. That explanation stays with Daniel. Because it explains something important about prison yards. The danger often comes from tension already building long before inmates enter the recreation area. Outside the housing unit windows, Daniel sees officers inspecting the yard again before reopening it. Search dogs move near the fences. Maintenance staff check drain covers and handball court areas. Tower officers remain visible above the yard all day. Security measures increase after every serious incident. But prison administrators know something difficult. No amount of security completely removes risk inside maximum security recreation yards. The following day, recreation resumes for selected housing units under stricter supervision. Smaller groups enter the yard. Movement is slower. Additional officers patrol near the basketball court where the emergency started earlier. Daniel notices inmates behaving differently now. More cautious. More alert. Even conversations seem quieter. The incident changed the atmosphere. As Daniel walks near the track, he studies how the yard functions. Every group maintains invisible boundaries. Certain tables belong to certain alliances. Workout areas are used carefully. Even walking paths remain organized. Inside prison yards, order often depends on inmates following unwritten rules as much as official prison regulations. Breaking those invisible rules can create tension quickly. Suddenly, a loud argument begins near the pull-up bars. Nothing physical yet. Just shouting. But officers react immediately. Tower staff focus downward. Ground officers move toward the area fast. Several inmates nearby begin backing away before officers even arrive. Because experienced inmates understand how quickly prison yards can change. The officers separate the inmates within seconds. One inmate is escorted off the yard immediately. The rest of the yard remains open. That matters. Because prison staff successfully prevented the situation from spreading. Modern correctional strategy often focuses heavily on rapid intervention before larger conflicts begin. Daniel notices Victor watching the officers carefully afterward. "They stopping things earlier now," Victor says quietly. Daniel nods. "Too much pressure after yesterday." Victor looks across the yard toward the fencing area. That's how yards survive. If staff lose control out here, everything changes. Those words feel important. Because prison yards operate on balance. Control. Observation. Routine. Once that balance breaks, chaos can spread fast. As recreation time continues, the atmosphere slowly relaxes again. Inmates return to walking laps. Others sit quietly at tables. For a moment, the yard almost feels normal. Then Daniel notices something strange near the far fence line. Two correctional officers suddenly begin sprinting toward a blind spot near the maintenance gate. One officer immediately grabs his radio. Another signals toward the tower above. The entire yard reacts again. Inmates stop moving. Officers shout commands. And this time, the emergency seems connected not to inmate conflict, but to something officers may have just discovered hidden near the yard itself.